All right, so Nintendo has been around for over 3 decades, and that's something that may come as a surprise to many people. But for those who actually grew up back in the 80s, early 90s, is not because you were there to witness everything, and you probably just feel old just thinking about it. But as far as this past 3 decades are concerned, the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s, and we have also the teens decade. We're not fully done with this decade yet, but we're getting there. But as far as the 80s, 90s, and the 2000s are concerned, it's debatable on which decade was probably the best for Nintendo. A lot of people say it was the 80s because that's where everything started. With the NES console coming out back in 1983, you saw the beginning of the Mario, Zelda, Metroid, and series, and all that stuff, which carried over into the 90s. And then we got 16-bit games like Super Mario World, Link to the Past, and Super Metroid Prime, and all those games. And then we got into the 2000s, and the 2000s also had some pretty cool titles, such as I believe GameCube, you had Metroid Prime, you had Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, and then on the Wii console you had The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, and you also had Super Mario Galaxy, which were all really big games. And in fact, the 2000s was actually the decade where it seemed like Nintendo has had more success on a financial level than any other decade. Reason being is because Nintendo came out with probably two of the best game consoles that they've ever made, and that's the Nintendo DS and the Nintendo Wii. Now, for those who do not know, the Nintendo DS has managed to sell at least 154 million units worldwide since its release back in 2004, while the Nintendo Wii managed to sell over 101 million units worldwide back after its release back in 2006. And basically, since that time period, it seemed like Nintendo was on a roll until they released the Wii U back in 2012, and then it seems like the Wii U was a flop for whatever reason. High pricing, I don't know, not enough interest. Really depends on who you ask on why the Wii didn't do as good as many people expected. But when we look at the 2000s, it seemed like there was so many good games that came out on Nintendo-based consoles, from the GameCube to the Wii to Nintendo DS. And it was been proven that Nintendo has no equal in relation to portable gaming with the DS, and it seems like there's never going to be another portable game system or game console that's going to surpass the Nintendo DS. Basically, it seemed like Nintendo has set the bar in terms of portable gaming, and it doesn't look like anyone's going to pass it, because as we currently know, that Sony has basically, they're going to discontinue the Vita soon. So I guess Nintendo is basically unparalleled in relation to portable gaming. But as far as the 2000s is concerned, I mean, that was probably the best decade in terms of sales and and earnings and and everything else on a financial level. While the 80s and the early 90s is probably the best time period for Nintendo, I guess, in terms of popularity. Maybe it was more popular back in the 80s and the early 90s, but the 2000s was without a doubt where Nintendo was basically at its peak in terms of I wouldn't say at its peak, but basically everything was optimal prior to the games and everything they developed before that. Everything was basically just on point, and the quality was so good to a point where people would even buy Nintendo-based consoles over the competition. And you got to remember, this was a time period where Nintendo was competing with Sony's PS2 and PS3, along with Microsoft's original Xbox console and the 360. And the Wii still somehow managed to, be one of the best-selling game consoles of the 2000s decades. So in terms of Whether or not Nintendo Switch will surpass the Wii in sales is something that remains to be seen. As far as whether or not they'll ever have a game system that will surpass Nintendo DS is also something that remains to be seen. But there is, without a doubt, that the 2000s was definitely a great decade for Nintendo in relation to gaming.